Letters that change history sometimes don't even make it into the mail. Inside, every family is an unopened box, and sometimes the lid of that box is only opened by time itself. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Fall 2023. As the winds of the day swept across college campuses, Sarah Donnelly, the archivist responsible for the Kennedy family's old family archives, came across a small compartment behind a frame that had been in place on the wall and had gone unnoticed for years. It had been opened during the restoration of a room from JFK's Harvard years. What was inside the wall? A long, thin box wrapped in dark blue velvet. Inside, a single yellowed envelope. The envelope read, "If I'm not here when this reaches you, then maybe it never should." Below, a simple signature, JFK. Sarah did not open the envelope. She immediately forwarded it to the Kennedy Archive Center. From that moment on, the letter became a subject not only for archivists but also for the memory of a nation, because this letter was written just 3 weeks before the election. Kennedy was not yet president, but the letter seemed to be written not to a president but to a witness. No statement was made to the press. The Kennedy family temporarily sealed the letter, saying, "It will be shared when necessary." But weeks later, a sentence leaked to the press changed everything. "I didn't know your name, I only knew your silence. I didn't know his name, I only knew his silence." Now, viewer, here's a question for you. If a letter were written to someone you didn't know and sat unopened for 60 years, did it really wait its time, or was that letter never written to you but to your conscience? Leave it in the comments. Because this story is not just about a letter, but about a century of silence re-echoing. When the contents of the letter were first published publicly by the Boston Review, only a few lines were shown. But one of the family's granddaughters, JFK's great-niece Claire Kennedy Monroe, broke her silence. She said, her eyes welling up at a press conference, "This letter is a reminder that my great-uncle was not only a leader but also a witness. As a family, we were afraid that this letter would be opened because there was a voice in it, a voice that had been silenced before us." Journalists began pressing for more. Who was this letter about? Why was it written? And why was it never sent? The answers started coming in slowly. The first clue came with a second small note inside the envelope. It was written in handwriting, just 3 words, "For the girl." The letter was addressed to someone, but that person was nowhere to be identified. No name, no address, no photograph, just a load. Viewer, I will now take you to the last weeks of 1960, the busiest days of the election campaign. Kennedy and Nixon are neck and neck, but there is another detail on Kennedy's agenda that the public does not know. His silent visits between election rallies, the sentences he wrote in his notebook every night, and an address he insisted on visiting in a small town in Massachusetts, Sutton Mills Orphanage. The orphanage director's notebook records read as follows: "Mr. Kennedy came a 3rd time. He just stood at the door again. He asked for permission to visit. He just looked at the window. It was as if he was trying to make eye contact with someone." But no one noticed this incident in those days, until the lines inside the letter. The first page of the letter revealed, "I don't know who you are, but one night I heard your voice. You weren't shouting, you were just breathing, but that breath was louder to me than the entire campaign. Perhaps you will never receive this letter. Perhaps years later another hand will open it. But I am not writing this to you. I am writing to all those who cried silently that night, but were afraid to shed a tear. Because I heard you, and if I become president, I will speak where you remain silent." When these lines leaked to the media, the country was divided. Some highlighted the deep human aspect of the letter. Others claimed that JFK had known about a crime, even a systemic abuse that he had witnessed in the past but never disclosed it. At that moment, a retired employee of the Sutton Mills Orphanage came forward, her name Agnes Holloway. She was old, her voice cracked, but her eyes were still alive. Her exact words in the CNN interview, "I remember that night. I was on duty when Mr. Kennedy came. I saw him outside the window, and him looking at that girl, a little girl. I never learned her name, but that night, someone was silenced. After these words, the letter is no longer just an emotional memory. It is the opening of a file, a case, and perhaps a crime. The FBI decided to open the Sutton Mills records from 1960, and there, the records contained an emergency transfer order for an unnamed 8-year-old girl. The date of the transfer, just before the week John F. Kennedy was elected president. And the person who made the transfer, Harold L. Westgate, the director of the Protective Services at the time. Viewer, what do you feel now? A leader is just talking N, or is he someone who witnesses silence but remains silent? Write in the comments, because this story will not end here. This was just the first lines of a letter. History books record campaign data, rally numbers, and vote rates. But sometimes history is a letter a man writes to a child he has never even seen. The letter that JFK wrote weeks before he was elected president and was never sent was no longer just a family memory. It had become the voice of a ghost hidden by a generation, a girl's silenced past. But the truth was not between the lines of that letter. It was in what was not said. When the Washington Post reported that the remaining parts of the letter had been made public with special permission, people stayed up all night in front of the National Archives building. Some held signs. Whose voice was silenced? Was JFK really a witness? The Kennedy family made an official statement after this raid, and the entire letter, in its original 8-page form, was published digitally. A statement on the second page drew all attention to one person. I only saw him through the glass. He reached out. But then someone closed that window. At that moment, it was as if the whole campaign stopped. And the sentence that followed, I have not forgotten your eyes. And if you ever read this, know that I loved you without ever knowing you. This sentence revealed the protective instinct that one of the most powerful figures in American politics felt for an unknown child, but also fear. Because why wasn't that letter sent? Why was it just hidden? These questions were no longer just questions for historians, the FBI's too. The agency requested records from Sutton Mills Orphanage between 1958 and 1962. However, many documents were either missing or had been lost for unknown reasons. At that moment, an unexpected person broke his silence. Dr. Lionel Hart, a child development consultant at Boston Medical School at the time, told me by phone years after his retirement. We used to have to leave some cases off the books because of political risk. In October 1960, a girl was brought to us who had eidetic memory trauma. Her name was never given, but she had a scar on her left wrist, and she kept saying, there was someone behind the glass. Journalists immediately began investigating. A girl with a scar on her left wrist, a man standing behind the glass, the image Kennedy described in his letter. The pieces began to come together, and then a name emerged, Annabelle Marsh. Her name first appeared in a footnote in the Sutton Mills nursing reports, age 8, motherless. Her father's name unknown. She was admitted to the institution in 1952, and in November 1960 she was suddenly transferred to another state. Reason for transfer: psychological rehabilitation. However, no records could be found after this transfer. Annabelle had seemingly disappeared. Viewer, a person can be destroyed not only by not dying, but also by being forgotten. Write in the comments. We want to hear your feelings about this story, because sometimes history is not black and white. Sometimes it has never been written. The Kennedy family held an internal meeting regarding these developments. Claire Kennedy Monroe was the first person to discover the letter, and now she made the following statement on behalf of the family. This is the first time we have heard the name Annabelle Marsh. However, if this is the person our great-uncle mentioned in his letter, finding her is both a historical responsibility and a humanitarian duty. Just 10 days after this statement, I received a call from California. I'm Annabelle Marsh. I didn't know about your letter, but I've had the same dream for years. A man behind the glass, and I'm trying to tell him my name. The whole country went silent. An interview was arranged. Annabelle, now 71, had gray hair, a soft voice, eyes that looked far away. And for years, she had lived as a nursing home worker without even knowing her true identity. She said the following in the interview: "They carried me overnight. A man with no name pulled me by the arm. They put me in a car. I never went back to Sutton Mills. But I always remembered the face of that man in the window, and then I saw it on the television screen years later as Kennedy." The host asked, "So why didn't you talk?" "Because I wasn't even told who I was, but now, if that letter exists, I exist." Tears flowed as Annabelle took the entire letter in her hand. He read that sentence again. "I haven't forgotten your eyes." And he said, "I never knew you either, but you were the only person who heard my silence." Viewer, if you've come this far, here's a question for you. If a man, before he sat in the most important seat in history, heard the silence of a single child, and that silence followed him for years, what kind of leader was that man? Leave it in the comments, because this story is not just JFK's, it's the story of all children who have been silenced. Sometimes you feel like you've talked to someone your whole life, even though you don't know them, with just a look, a silence, or a letter that was never sent. At 71, Annabelle Marsh is no longer just a name lost in the past. She has become a voice that rewrote history, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 60 years after his death, still speaks with the silence he gave her. When the second page of the letter was read to Annabelle in the NBC special, her eyes filled with tears. This line was there: "If this letter doesn't reach you, know that I saw you that night. Where no one heard you, I am ashamed of my silence." Millions of viewers were watching. Annabelle stroked the lines of the letter with her hands, and then she said these words: "I knew that no one would hear me that night, but one look taught me that night will not be forgotten." And then she looked up. Slowly, hesitantly, he said, "They silenced me, but his silence kept me alive." Audience, now I want to ask you, have you ever felt understood without speaking? Have you ever felt like someone heard you without making a sound? If your answer is yes, this story could be about you too. Leave it in the comments, because this story does not end here. On the contrary, it opens up a new history. The Kennedy family invited Annabelle to the Kennedy Library in Boston at the request of the public. There, a special ceremony was prepared for Annabelle in the section of the family's legacy, which includes JFK's final correspondence. Claire Kennedy Monroe took the stage at the ceremony. She was holding a black box frame. Inside was an exact copy of JFK's letter with the following sentence underneath: "Some letters change laws. This one changed a life." Some letters change laws. This letter changed a life. Annabelle could not hold back her tears. The entire room was silent. Then Claire took the microphone and said, "Mr. President, we read your letter, and now we are not only apologizing to those who have been silenced, we are making room. A new section has been added to the library. It is called the Silent Archive. This section documents the voices that have been left unheard, suppressed, and pushed to the background at different times in American history." Annabelle Marsh was honored there as the first witness to break her silence, but the truly touching moment: the following digital memorial at the beginning of that section. A sentence projected in JFK's handwriting: "Sometimes the loudest voices are the ones we choose not to hear." There was one other person who did not speak to the press that day. The youngest generation of the Kennedy family, Noah Kennedy, 18. He came to Annabelle and whispered one sentence: "If he couldn't save you that night, we will never lose you." And for the first time, Annabelle pointed to the frame in her lap and smiled. "My name is here now," he said. "I am no longer just a witness. I am the narrator." Audience, if this story has touched you, don't just watch, join, write in the comments. If you have ever been silent and someone has heard you, let us hear it too. Subscribe. Because here we are not only the voice of presidents, but also of those who have been silenced.